G'day guys, this is Mr. Coumbe. This is my lesson on psychological research. So, when it comes to psychology, one of the sort of the big areas that you might go into, other than practical and clinical psychology, is research. A lot of clinical psychologists would be involved in a lot of research as well. However, research can involve many great things, but not just in psychology. You might be involved in medical research, which will involve very similar sort of designs and concepts that we will be covering in this particular lesson. So we need to really answer, like, why would we actually want to do research? There's a whole bunch of questions in psychology, particularly a lot of questions about how humans behave, how humans think, how humans feel, that we might want to try to answer, to try to really find some things out about not only ourselves but others, and how we can most optimally work with that. And when things do go wrong, well, how can we deal with it when things go wrong? Here are some questions that you might either have thought about before or would like to maybe have a look at. Well, what are the potential answers to some of these questions? Like, is there such a thing as ESP? How can we actually be motivated? How do we motivate ourselves? What's the science of dreams and how do dreams work? Is how we are born or how we are brought up more important? How does the mind and the connection between the mind and the body actually affect the way we feel? How is it that, what are some ways that we can communicate with others in a better manner than we currently do? Like, what in the world is intelligence, and like, why is it so important? If you've never come across this term, like, what does it mean to be self-actualization? Like, to be self-actualized. And those who love music, why is music so good? And does your personality, the factors about your personality that affect your happiness? All right, so just for a little bit of so as we're going through this, we're going to go through these two and some other examples, but first there's a couple of questions that I've come up with. So there's question number 1, do sports drinks affect how students think? And question number 2, well, does personality influence how happy we get? So in order to even want to come to answering those two questions, we need to do some science in order to actually come up with some conclusions that have evidence to back it up. So then we go to the scientific method. The scientific method is a 7-step method, but like, arguably there are different ways you can interpret this. But in psychology, this is how we look at it. We need to identify, we need to develop, we need to choose how we actually design the method, because depending on our design and who we measure, and how we measure, what measurement tools we actually use, how we allocate people into groups, it's going to determine not only our results, but determine how good those results are. Then we actually have to perform it, so collect data. Then that data, we need to have a look at what does that mean. What's the meaning of this data? Then we need to have a look at how that data can be interpreted. And then eventually find a place where those findings can actually be told to other people, so that it can make some sort of impact. Here is just a quick diagrammatic view of the scientific method itself. All right, so we have those two questions. So we need to have a look at the types of general research. In general, there are two main types of research, either experimental or non-experimental. In experimental research, really, this is the most important thing. Only one variable is actually manipulated by the experimenter. We call that the IV, or independent variable. And then we have a look at how that actually affects another variable, which we call the dependent variable, the variable that we measure. Now, in experimental research, ideally, every other variable is controlled, because all those variables might actually change or affect the dependent variable. So, i.e., we want to control those things. By controlling those things, we can come up with what we call a cause and effect relationship. that can be established between the independent variable, the thing that we are actually manipulating, and the dependent variable itself, to have a look at the effect on that. Now, experimental research, now depending on the way it's done, ideally you should be able to replicate a bit of research, an experiment, and ideally it should give you the exact same results. Okay, if it shows us the exact same results, then we can say that that data is reliable. But ideally in any kind of science, that's not always 100% the case. You can get very close to, or you can get some research that's horrible and the data cannot be replicated and gives us horrible data. That happens a lot as well. Now, the problem with experimental research, especially when it comes to psychological research, when we want to see the natural state of behavior, right, is that behavior happens in their own environments, and it's very, very hard to replicate behavior or human factors in a clinical setting. So we have something called low ecological validity, i.e. those situations are artificially made, which might not reflect what actually happens in real life behavior. So that's a bit of a disadvantage to experimental research. Whereas non-experimental research, because here's the important thing, the variables themselves are not necessarily changed directly by the experimenter. And because they're not actually directly affected or manipulated by the experimenter, we cannot establish a cause and effect relationship. Now, we can only get and demonstrate associations, or also known as a correlation between those two variables. Now, there's been a lot of criticism when it comes to correlational studies. So, for example, like there is a stat where the rate of increase in global temperatures correlates very well with the number of decrease of pirates, i.e. the conclusion from there can be, and it's a bit ludicrous, that the less pirates we have, the hotter the earth that we have. So should we get more pirates in order to decrease global warming? Well, probably not. So big importance is you can't establish cause and effect. However, there are a lot of factors that can that their change actually has there are factors within particular changes of particular factors, so that we can actually analyze those factors and how they co-change, how they co-inhabit with each other. And that's, for those who are taking psychology later on, even further, that's called factor analysis, but that's pretty much down the road. Now, the actual types of non-experimental research methods, they're case studies. So a case study is usually a one-off sort of type of research where something happens to one person and then we do a really detailed study of that one person. We can give surveys out as well. Now, surveys have a tendency to be correlational because, surveys tend to be opinions. Now, correlational studies is when we look at different data, right, and gather those data and see how the two might actually affect each other, and how there are factors that might change with the changes in that data. Now, archival research is when data has already been, and research has already been done, and we can bring data together to see if there are any kind of relationships. So that concludes today's quick lesson on the beginning of experimental method. Next, we're going to talk about a little bit more about the actual design itself. I'm Mr. Coumbe. Thank you very much.